Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andy Keeler, and on behalf of my fellow faculty members, Lindsay Dubbs and Linda Dana, I'd like to welcome you to the public presentation of the research from the 2019 Outer Banks Field Site class. The Outer Banks Field Site is a joint enterprise of UNC Chapel Hill Institute of the Environment and the Coastal Studies Institute, the beautiful building where you are right now. It's a semester-long program that combines rigorous academics, 3 full courses, 2 days of internships every week, a wide variety of community interactions, and also a field-based research project, which is what you're going to see today. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank our wonderful Community Advisory Board, who have helped the students so much. We'd especially like to thank the town of Nags Head, Holly White, David Ryan, and Andy Garman in particular, who have been fabulous partners in this enterprise. We'd like to thank all of the internship mentors, and especially Corey Adams, sitting unobtrusively in the back, who's done such a great job of running the program for the last 4 or 5 years. Now, just a couple things about the research you're going to see. This is a complicated topic. It doesn't have easy answers, and the students were clear from the beginning they're not their job to tell people what to do or come up with a single right answer. It was their job to use the tools of rigorous academic research to learn new things about wastewater and stormwater and new things about the way the public and the government think about the options that they have. So part of what you're going to see is not just what they've learned, but how they've learned it. So you're going to see some methodology and statistics as well as just results. The second thing to keep in mind is that this has some elements of a work in progress. Carrying out original and secondary research in 4 months while taking a full load of classes, 2 days a week of internships, hanging out at the beach most afternoons, and doing this research is a lot to ask. These guys have done a great job. If they had a couple more months, they'd learn even more. So we hope that you guys will take the opportunity after this is over to meet some of the students, tell them what you know about this topic and what you have learned more generally about natural resource management on the Outer Banks. It would be of great value to them and to us. There's a written report, and for the first time, we're very excited to say a podcast that goes with this presentation you're going to see today. There are flash drives available in the back of the room that have the written report in PDF form and links to the podcast. If you don't get one or you want to just skip the flash drives, if you just remember to Google OBXFS, that's the call letters of the Outer Banks Field Site, you will be able to get the report and the podcast. We'd like to ask you to please hold your questions and comments to the end, where we'll have plenty of time for discussion. And with that, please welcome the Outer Banks Field Site class of 2019.
Hi, I'm Anna Gray Anderson. I'm a junior. I'm from Greenville, North Carolina, and my internship this semester was with Lad Bayless and the Outer Banks Conservationist.
Hello, I'm Emily Galvin. I'm also a junior. I'm from Princeton, New Jersey, and my internship was with the Planning Department of Kill Devil Hills.
Hi, I'm Claire Bradley. I'm a sophomore from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and this semester I interned with the North Carolina Coastal Federation.
Hi there, I'm Sarah Hinshaw. I'm a senior and I'm from Winston-Salem, and I interned with the planning department in Nags Head.
Hi, I'm Emma Calhoun. I'm a junior. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I interned with our MC, Andy Keeler.
Hi, I'm Haley Kaplan. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm a sophomore, and I interned with the North Carolina Coastal Federation.
Hello, I'm Connor Badgett, and I'm a senior from Statesville, North Carolina, and I internshipped with Quibble & Associates.
My name is Rachel O'Reilly. I'm a senior from Cary, North Carolina, and I did an internship with Dr. Kimberly Rogers.
My name is Bailey Williams. I'm a junior from Jacksonville, North Carolina, and I interned with Melissa Dickerson, the town planner of Manio.
My name is Peter Marcoux. I'm a senior. This is actually the last day of my college career. I'm from Bethesda, Maryland, and I interviewed with Paul Doshkov at the Cape Hatteras National Seashore.
Hi, I'm Avery Murray. I'm a senior as well, and I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. And this semester, I interned with Ann Daisy at the Dare County Soil and Water Conservation District.
Hello, my name is Krishan Hardy. I'm a senior from Greenville, North Carolina, and I interned with the Outer Banks Voice in Nags Head. And I'll be getting a start today. So first of all, I just want to thank you guys again for coming. We really appreciate you guys being here, and we're super excited to share our research with you. So I'll just get us started with a brief overview of what we'll be talking about today, and then sort of give you guys our problem statement. So first, we'll get getting started with an introduction, which after this includes a brief overview of the study site, as well as sort of the hydrological processes and interactions that we've been looking at. After that, we'll go right into our research, which is broken up into 3 different parts. The first being analysis of the water level and susceptibility, which involves sort of measuring the depth of water table and mapping that out. Then we'll go into a water quality analysis, which involved taking samples and running bacterial and nutrient analysis on that. And finally, we go through a human dimensions portion, which focused on sort of looking at different people's water evaluation as well as risk perception. After that, we'll sort of go through what we did to sort of raise awareness, our podcast portion, and then we'll go through a conclusion and discussion where we sort of wrap up everything we did and talk about our overall conclusions, and then we'll open up for questions. So our problem statement that we started at the beginning of the semester with, and then looked at throughout the semester, was looking at how altered hydrological patterns threaten coastal infrastructure, especially as it pertains to wastewater systems like septic. And to sort of break that down more for you, what we're looking at is sort of changes in systems or in the system that sort of led to more flooding, increased storm intensity in the area, and how that sort of affects existing infrastructure and potential future development, and vice versa, how development affects that as well. To go in more in depth with that, here's Avery.
Thanks, Chris. Oh. I've forgotten that every single time we've practiced. All right, so our study took place in Nags Head, North Carolina, which is located in the Outer Banks. And for those of you who don't know, the Outer Banks is a chain of barrier islands located on the east coast of North Carolina. So we collected data from a specific area of Nags Head called the Gallery Row sub-watershed, which is bordered by Bonnet Street to the south, 8th Street to the north, the Atlantic Ocean to the east, and to the west, the Nags Head Woods Nature Preserve. So this area has unique topography. It's shaped sort of like a dish or a bowl, and it's low elevation, so the area has frequent problems with flooding. Also, the area is highly developed, so this contributes to the flooding that the area experiences. All right, so to further contextualize the issues that are facing our study site, I'm going to conduct a brief overview of barrier island hydrology. And when I talk about hydrology, I'm talking about how water moves in relation to the land. So areas where water collects are called reservoirs. You might recognize the sound in the ocean as some important reservoirs. But for our study, we were interested in the groundwater and the surface water reservoirs. So the groundwater is all the water that's held in the pores of the soil underground, and it can be found in 2 aquifers, the unconfined aquifer and the confined aquifer. So surface water occurs when the top of the unconfined aquifer, which is known as the water table, intersects with the land surface. So as you can see in this diagram, the unconfined aquifer is very interconnected with the bodies of water that are near it and also the land surface. So for our study, as Chris mentioned earlier, we were interested in seeing how wastewater treatment systems, and particularly septic systems, affect the unconfined aquifer and the water in it. So I'd like to draw your attention to the 2 wells that are depicted in this diagram. Actually don't know how to use the pointer, which are marked AW and PW. So AW represents a well that's drilling into the confined aquifer, which is the water that we would use for drinking. And then for our study, we were interested in the unconfined aquifer, so we sampled from wells like PW, which are just monitoring wells in the unconfined aquifer. And Peter's going to take over and tell you a little bit about wastewater and how it's treated.
Thank you. So, like Avery said, I'm going to give a brief overview of wastewater and its treatment systems here. So when we talk about wastewater in this presentation, we're talking about water that's used in a home or place of business and then sent down any sort of drain, whether that be a toilet, sink, shower, laundry machine, anything like that. And then once it's sent down that drain, it goes to the wastewater treatment system. And in Nags Head, as is the case in most of the rural United States, that wastewater treatment system is likely going to be a septic tank. Nags Head, over 80% of the population here uses septic to treat their wastewater. So once it goes down that drain, it goes through the inlet pipe into the tank itself, And at that point, the solids are going to settle to the bottom, while the liquids, which we call effluent, is going to flow through slowly. And as it's flowing through the system, it's going to be treated by the bacteria that live there to break down the harmful molecules and all that are in the waste. And once that process kind of takes its course, it then goes through the outlet pipe and into the drain field, which is a large spread out series of pipes. If you're on a residential lot, that's likely going to be in your yard. And that drain field just spreads out the waste and lets it leach into the soil, where it will slowly flow down into the groundwater. And as it's flowing down, as it's percolating through the soil, there are more bacteria that are once again treating it to make sure it is not a threat to public health. And as you can imagine, the longer it has in the soil, the more treated it's going to be. So let's talk about those fecal contaminants. In our study, we looked at 3 fecal contaminants in particular, the first being coliform bacteria as a whole, and then more specifically in that group, we looked at E. coli specifically, and then thirdly, we looked at Enterococcus bacteria, and all of these are found in the fecal matter of warm-blooded mammals, including humans. And if you're exposed to those, there's a whole host of health problems that you might crop up. So it is vital that you don't get exposed to those. That being said, there are more ways to treat wastewater than just septic. For instance, here are 2 alternatives. Central sewage is the one I'm most familiar with growing up in a more densely populated area. With the central sewage system, all the homes and places of business are linked to one large interconnected series of pipes and drains that carry all the wastewater down into one centralized municipal wastewater treatment area. And kind of the middle ground between septic and central in a lot of cases is packaged treatment plants, which are smaller, more centralized areas where a small group of homes in maybe a neighborhood or just small area are linked to one wastewater treatment area, and that might take the form of septic. It might look more like centralized wastewater treatment, but the key is that it's just a few groups of lots that are in a local area all sending their wastewater to one small package plant nearby. And this isn't to say that there are only 3 types of wastewater treatment. There are more types. There are a lot of systems that use peat in the soil to process waste more efficiently. But the key is that Nags Head uses septic to treat its wastewater, and to transition to an alternative would likely be very expensive and require a lot of change in infrastructure. So we're focusing on septic. And to talk to you more, here is Bailey.
Thank you, Peter. So now we're going to talk about what happens when these systems don't work like they should. One risk to septic systems in Nags Head is our high water table. So as Peter mentioned, filtration of septic contaminants depends on the distance between the outflow of the septic tank and the distance to the top of the groundwater. So having a high water table means less distance between, and therefore less filtration processes are able to happen. Another risk to septic systems here is lack of maintenance, improper maintenance, and that can be done by property owners. This can stem from a lack of financial resources or a lack of information. And an example of this would be if a property owner didn't know how often to get their system pumped, or maybe they did know but lacked financial resources to do that. And for those reasons, septic tanks can fail. As Avery mentioned in the hydrology section, groundwater eventually leads into larger bodies of water. So if I were to extend this graphic here, I would maybe draw the sound on this side and the ocean on this side. So it can be pretty damaging to our larger bodies of water when a septic tank doesn't have the opportunity to filter as much as it should before it reaches the groundwater. And being here in Nags Head, a town based on tourism, that can be especially damaging. To minimize the effects of wastewater contamination, the town of Nags Head has created several programs aimed to reduce the risks of septic contamination, or rather septic system failures. The Todd D. Kraft Septic Health Initiative encourages property owners to pump, repair, and inspect their systems. These incentives are in the form of financial assistance and free inspections. For instance, if you got your system pumped, you can receive a discount on your water bill, and you can receive low interest loans to make repairs to your system. And this is a graphic they send out, not a graphic, this is a flyer they send out that just shows some of the benefits of the program and what a septic system failure would look like. They also created a groundwater lowering project to reduce flooding in low-lying areas. So what this looks like, in those low-lying areas, they add a pumping well, or PW, to the groundwater, and these wells suck up the groundwater, sending that water to an off-site reservoir. And by removing the water, the soil now has more space to hold on water pre-flooding. So these areas are now more resilient to floodwaters. And this also creates longer distances between the septic outflow and the top of the groundwater. So more filtration is able to happen. And this creates drier soil, obviously, and drier soil compared to wet soil is also more equipped to break down contaminants. Yes, and that concludes the introduction to our project, and I'm going to hand it off to Rachel, who's going to talk more about what we actually did.
Thank you, Bailey. So a little bit about our research project. There were 3 components, and each component aligned with a specific research question. And these 3 components were a water level and susceptibility analysis, or water quality analysis, and a human dimensions analysis. So for our water level and susceptibility analysis, we compared surface elevation to the elevation of the water table. And we did this by collecting water level data and conducting a geospatial susceptibility analysis. In a minute, Connor will come to talk to you more about that GIS analysis. And for our second question, we looked at a water quality analysis. We sampled the groundwater in the unconfined aquifer to look for the presence of bacteria and nutrients that would indicate interaction with human wastewater. And then for our third question, we did a human dimensions analysis where we interviewed members of the Nags Head community and other stakeholders to understand how they perceive risk to contamination from surface and groundwater and how that interacts with wastewater. And now I'm going to spend a minute talking about our water level and susceptibility analysis. So this is a map of our well locations for water level data collection. We sampled the water level at 7 different times between September 21st and October 29th. And as shown in this figure, we took what is called depth to groundwater measurements, which is the distance between the ground surface and the water in the top of the water table. And we did these using a water level meter, which we would lower into the ground, and when that meter beeped, we would record that distance in feet. And here's Connor to talk to you more about how we use that data in our GIS analysis.
Thank you, Rachel. So the goal of the water level analysis was to create maps showing the areas in and around the Gallery Row sub-watershed that are susceptible to interactions between undertreated septic wastewater and groundwater. So to define the susceptibility, we're defining that as an insufficient separation between the land surface elevation and the water table. So as we talked about earlier, septic tanks require a separation between the water table and the land surface in order to properly treat septic effluent. So when we took those water level measurements, what we were really interested in was finding where the water table is in relation to the land surface. And so we took what was called depth to groundwater measurements, or DTGW. And from that, we can calculate the water table elevation. So if we take the land surface elevation, abbreviated to LSE, and shown in the orange arrow, and we subtract from that the depth to the groundwater, we can find the water table elevation. So we did that for each of the 7 days of measurement for each of the wells. So that gives us the water table elevation at each of these points for each of those 7 days. So in order to estimate, well, the next step was estimating where the water table elevation is throughout this transect of Nags Head. So we did that using a GIS, or a Geographic Information System, and this is a representation of that water table. So the next step to find the separation between the water table and the land surface elevation was to subtract the estimated water table elevation from the land surface elevation. And that gives us our susceptibility maps. So this is a map from September 21st, 2019. And this shows the susceptibility of the areas in and around Gallery Row sub-watershed. So a blue area represents a high susceptibility, or a less than 3 feet separation between the water table and the land surface. And so an orange area represents a moderate susceptibility, and that's between, oh, I forgot to mention, sorry, that a 3 feet separation is based on a North Carolina general statute that states that there needs to be 3 feet of separation between the land surface and the water table to properly treat that effluent. So an orange area represents a moderate susceptibility from 3.1 to 6 feet, and that's based on the fact that septic tanks are buried below the ground, and they require that 3 feet of separation. A green area represents a low susceptibility, or anywhere greater than 6 feet of separation. So the key takeaway from this map is that about 50% of the Gallery Row subwatershed is susceptible to these kinds of interactions between Route 12 and 158, and slightly west of 158. And those areas are along roads and businesses, so yes. So then we averaged those susceptibility categories for each of the 7 days of measurement. And this is what we see. There's an average of about 50% of the high susceptibility category during the sampling period. And it has a pretty low standard deviation, which means that about half of Gallery Row subwatershed is consistently highly susceptible to those interactions. So some preliminary conclusions. What I've just said, about 50% is consistently highly susceptible, and these areas seem to be low-lying and flat and around residences, roads, and businesses. This did have some limitations, however. You can see we had not very many wells inside of our study area. We had a pretty short sampling period. We used 2014 land elevation data, which means we could have lost some information there, like development since then. We didn't account for soil type, which can affect how effluent is treated in the soil. And then we had a loss of resolution in the aerial extent analysis, which I can answer questions about later. So the final conclusion from this is that we believe that these maps point out a potential water quality issue in Nags Head that warrants further investigation. And to talk more about water quality, here's Haley.
Thank you, Connor. So our second question, we asked if the bacterial and chemical indicators decreased with the lowering of the subwatershed. So to answer this question, we sampled from four groundwater wells and one surface water ditch, and we separated these sampling dates based on wet or dry, and wet meant that it had rained a couple of days prior to the sampling date, and dry meant that it didn't rain in that time period. So in order to take these samples, we sampled from groundwater and one surface water ditch. And so for groundwater, we used a baler and we lowered it into the well, and Bailey is showing the baler that we lowered. And then for surface water, we used a pick stick, which we put the bottle in and lowered into the surface water ditch in order to collect our sample. And then we put them in these coolers and we took them back to the lab for processing. Thank you, Bailey. So for processing, we used an accepted protocol for bacteria, and they came out into these trays. And in these trays, they either fluoresced, like in this photo, or they showed color, and that indicated if there was bacteria present and how much bacteria was present. And also, we analyzed optical brighteners, which are found in laundry detergent, and the reason for this is because they indicate human use, and so the bacteria that we found could be either from wildlife or humans, and because it's in fecal matter. So the optical brighteners are supposed to indicate that it came from a human source and not a wildlife or pets that had droppings around the area. And after we analyzed the bacteria and the optical brighteners, we then had results, and Emma is going to talk about those results.
Thank you, Haley. Okay, so before I start talking, first off, I want to say that I don't have any fun pictures like Haley, just boring graphs, but I think they're really cool, and that we have a ton more data that we have to show you, but it's going to be in our report, which you should check out later today after you leave here. And finally, all of this bacteria that I'm about to show you in the water is not drinking water. Okay, so first I'm going to show you our E. coli concentrations. So this is year 2018, so this is from last year's capstone, and then this is this year in 2019, and the blue is going to indicate our dry sampling events, and the red is going to indicate our wet sampling events. And I also want to point out that this is only from one of our well sites, because only one of our sites, or not well sites, surface water ditch, was the only one that showed any concentrations of E. coli. So that's our surface water ditch right here, which is by the Red Drum Restaurant, if you're familiar with that. So I want to point out this yellow line right here, which is our EPA threshold, which is 126 colony-forming units of E. coli. And the reason we have an EPA threshold is basically because there are no thresholds or any kind of guidelines for well water, so we use recreational waters, and that is mostly because we're assuming that this groundwater is going to eventually mix with surface water that all of you guys are going to be interacting with. And it's also just a good threshold to have for showing if something has good or bad water quality. Okay, so as I'm going to point out on this graph, 2018 levels of E. coli are noticeably higher than our 2019 levels of E. coli. And what we assumed, or what our interpretations are from this, is that the groundwater lowering scheme that my friend Bailey mentioned earlier could have potentially be the reason for why the 2018 values are noticeably higher than the 2019, is that when we added this pumping well and we lowered the groundwater, there's all of this extra room right here, which is drier conditions, which is where all the bacteria is broken down. So if we have more of this soil, dry soil, it's perfect conditions to break down bacteria. So that could be one of the reasons why we have better water quality this year. And then another one could potentially be that we have noticeably drier conditions in 2019, so there was definitely a lot less precipitation this year than there was in 2018. Okay, so now I'm going to just zoom in on the graph that I just showed you. So now we're looking at the same thing, mean E. coli concentrations and colony-forming units, and then this is our dry sample and our wet sample, same EPA threshold for recreational, the 126 colony-forming units, and this is in 2019, so we are well below that threshold, so hopefully that's a good thing that we maybe have better water quality this year. And my first limitation that I want to point out to y'all is that while we did have a couple wet sampling events, there were not enough to maybe accurately show how storm events impact water quality. So that's something we can maybe do in the future. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about Enterococcus. And all you need to know about Enterococcus is that it is as gross as it sounds. It is just as bad as E. coli. And I've been working on this project for 4 months, and I still don't really know how to spell it. So very similar to the last graph I showed you, we're going to have the year 2018, 2019, dry events are still blue, and wet events are still red. And what I want to point out is that similarly to the last graph, we also have noticeably lower concentrations in 2019 than we do in 2018. So hopefully that's a good thing. However, for the EPA threshold, which is same for recreational waters, this time it's 33 colony forming units, our 2019 values are still above that threshold. So that might be something to look for in the future, what that means. So next, I want to talk to you about how this is the same as the last graph, where I'm only talking to y'all about the surface water site. And the reason for that is because last year sampled from this same ditch, and this year we sampled from the ditch. But there's also a well that we sampled from this year called B14, and it is right next to the surface water ditch. So before I go into my next graph, I'm gonna tell you we're making the assumption that these two sites are mixing because of their close proximity and the surface water and groundwater interactions in that area. So this is a very similar graph as the last one. It's showing you mean enterococcus concentrations, and this time we have all of the study sites down here. So we have our Nags Head Wood, which is our control. We have B14 and surface water, which are both of the sites that are within the groundwater lowering area. And then we also have this B12 site. Same thing, dry is blue, and then the wet is red. And so what we're going to draw from this graph, from this trend, is that the B12 concentrations of enterococcus are noticeably higher than the B14 and the surface water. So we should note that the B14 and surface water is where the groundwater lowering is occurring, so it's improving our water quality potentially. B12 is not in that groundwater lowering site, and it potentially has a lot of impacts from a nearby household septic interactions, as we can also see, because it is noticeably higher than our control site, which has negligible to none enterococcus concentrations. Hard word to still say. Okay, so this is the final graph that we have for today, and this is showing our optical brighteners. So I'm going to reiterate what Haley said, is the reason we used optical brighteners is because it indicates human presence in our sites. And so even though we did not find presence of the human influence from the laundry detergents, we did find some reflectance values. And so optical brighteners reflect, they're what's in your laundry detergent, and it's going to reflect the light, so it makes your clothes look brighter. But organic matter also reflects. So while we still did find levels of reflectance in all of our sites, we were significantly below the threshold for determining if it was human influenced or not. And the threshold is 120,000. This only goes to 20,000, so it would be like way up there on the wall. It's definitely below it. So one of the limitations for that we discussed is that our sites are near businesses, and businesses probably aren't using laundry detergents, and they're also near large rental vacation homes, and most of those homes outsource their laundry to an off-site area, off-site business. And then it should also be noted that while you're on vacation, you might not be doing your laundry. I definitely wouldn't be doing my laundry, but then my mom's here and I don't do my laundry at home anyway, so that might not be a very valid point. So this is going to be our final conclusion from that, which is that we are interpreting it that the groundwater lowering project in Nags Head potentially increased our water quality. So we have better water qualities, that's why our bacteria concentrations have decreased and the E. coli and enterococcus. But it should be noted that there are also drier conditions this year, so that could also be the reason, not necessarily the groundwater lowering project. And so to turn it over to our qualitative analysis, I'm going to give it to Sarah.
Thank you, Emma. So now I'm going to get into the human dimensions analysis aspect of our research project. So this is our research question, but we kind of divided it into 4 mini questions so that we kind of better gauge what exactly it was that we were looking for. So these questions are, how do these different groups, how are they influenced by their environment? And how do these different groups interpret the surface and groundwater contamination? And then the last 2 are, what are these different groups the most aware of or the least aware of? And what are these groups the most concerned about and the least concerned about? And the groups that we use in our study were septic professionals, public officials, researchers, and property owners. And so just a quick little intro into qualitative analysis. So qualitative analysis is measured using things like interviews and observations, and it involves value measurements that deal with meanings and people's interpretations and their experiences. So while it does have benefits, it lets people explain things in their own words, and it also allows us to investigate more complex and harder to articulate topics. It does have some drawbacks. It is important to keep in mind that the qualitative data that we have isn't representative of what everyone in Nags Head thinks, but it does do a good job of going in depth about the meanings and behaviors and values that the people that we interview did have. So the first part of our process involved the semi-structured interviews with the stakeholders that I mentioned earlier. So we interviewed 4 property owners, 3 septic professionals, 6 public officials, and 5 researchers for a total of 18 interviews. And the way that these semi-structured interviews work is you follow an interview guide that has a list of the questions and topics that you want to cover in the interview. But the questions are written in a way, they're very open-ended, and so it allows the interviewee to kind of go on tangents or talk more about what's important to them or what they know the most about. And it also gives the interviewer the opportunity to kind of stray away from the script a little bit and follow up on some of those tangents. And we wrote 4 different interview guides, one for each of these stakeholder groups, and they did pretty much have the same questions and touch on the same themes. They were just tweaked a little bit so that we could kind of gauge the different types of knowledge that these stakeholders had. And then that brings us to the next part of our qualitative analysis. So after these interviews were done, they were recorded and then they were transcribed by the student who did them. And each student did 1 to 2 interviews. And once we had all of those transcripts, we uploaded them into NVivo, which is a software that allows for the organization and coding and analysis of this qualitative data. And so what codes are in NVivo, they are like keywords and phrases that represent some of the patterns and trends we're seeing in what people are saying. And this is a diagram of all the codes that we came up with. So you can see that the bigger circles here represent kind of the overarching trends and patterns that we were seeing, while the smaller bubbles are a little more specific and kind of sub-trends. And basically the most important thing to keep in mind about NVivo is it allows us to make sense of all the words. So it allows us to kind of come up with themes and better answer our research question. And so I'm just going to do a quick little example of how the coding process would work. So one public official in an interview said, "I think the knowledge gaps are how these systems function, the level of maintenance that is required to properly operate these systems, and then also the intersection with groundwater and how that reduces the performance of these systems." So the way that we coded this quote is that it is a public wastewater treatment knowledge gap. And so once all the interview transcripts were coded a couple times, we were able to come up with overarching themes and make sense of what everyone said. And so with that, I'm going to give it off to Claire to talk about the results.
Thank you, Sarah. So now for the analysis, we took all of the tagged quotes and phrases that were in those different codes that she showed you, and we turned them into 4 themes. And so those themes were water as a source of identity, environmental changes that people noticed, risk perceptions of the septic contamination that we were discussing earlier, and how to address that risk using different suggestions from the interviewees. So for water as a source of identity, we asked people what about the area matters to them and why. And we heard from lots of different interviewees that it's super important and it helps define their sense of place or how they're connected to the area. And so one public official said, "I think that the waters make Nags Head, and the whole Outer Banks are a place that directly interacts with water." And this quote shows how important and defining of a characteristic that the waters in this area are. And that was echoed by many of the other interviewees. One interview even talked about how their business could not be here without the waters, and so it was so necessary for their livelihood. And that strong sense of place really matters because it helps people notice and acknowledge the environmental changes that are occurring, because people are protective of their home and they want it to stay the way it is. And so we asked the interviewees about the environmental changes they were seeing, and we got lots of different responses, but most of them had to do with flooding and an increased flooding. And the interviewees attributed the flooding to 3 different things. One was an increase in development, and you can see that in the 2 pictures on the left, that there's been lots more development recently, and that creates more impervious surfaces, which doesn't allow the water to seep through, and so it'll pool up and cause what we know to be flooding. And then more storms, especially those once in X amount of year storms like Hurricane Dorian. People discuss how there have been much more damage from storms and how they've been more common, and Hurricane Dorian was definitely brought up a lot because of that as well. And then the last one that people discussed was a higher water table. And while it affects a lot of different groups, definitely septic professionals have to deal with it when they're installing their tanks to make sure that it's a deep enough distance. So one professional said, the water table has definitely been a big change in just a little bit of time. We have certain setbacks from water tables because we want our effluent coming out of tanks to have a filter process before it gets introduced back into the water table. So this septic professional shows how important it is to acknowledge the rising water table, because that's where they can stop the interactions that are occurring. And so these noticing of environmental changes, the fact that they're happening isn't necessarily a good thing, but the fact that people are noticing them is, because it helps them be able to perceive the different risks we're talking about and come up with ideas for how to address the risk. And so that brings us to the 3rd theme, which is kind of the heart of our question, which is how do the different stakeholder groups perceive the risk? And we found that septic professionals, public officials, and researchers all perceive a very high risk of the contamination between septic and groundwater and surface water. And so one researcher said, the water table in eastern North Carolina is very proximal to the surface of the land, and so in many cases, the drain field for a septic system can actually be residing within the water table, and in that case, the treatment will not take place as designed. So this researcher shows their really high risk perception, because they are noticing how there's a blurred line between the bottom of the drain field and the top of the water level, and that's where the contamination is occurring. And so while we found that these 3 groups had similar ideas on it, we found that the interviewees from the other group, which is the resident or property owner group, had much lower risk perceptions. So one resident said, I realize that wastewater directly affects the family and the ocean quality, and that can really affect our lives, and so it's very important. And this quote shows how the resident is perceiving a risk of something different, the contamination of ocean and sound. And while that may be true, it's not as much what we're focusing on here, and it can show us that they aren't perceiving as high of a risk as some of the other stakeholder groups of this type of contamination. And so that leads us to how to address the risk. And in addressing risk, there were lots of different suggestions, and one public official talked about individual action. So they said that residents just need to do their part and look at their own systems, maintain their systems, have them inspected, have them pumped. And while individual action is really valuable to helping solve this problem, it requires that people understand a septic system, have the means to fix it, and also that they're here most of the time, because many of the Nags Head residents aren't here all the time, and so they're not maintaining their system. And then they come in, and there's a huge influx of work that the septic system has to do. And so Nags Head is definitely helping with the struggle to have the means to fix septic systems through the Septic Health Initiative, and also for understanding how septic systems work, which is important for the people that come into Nags Head not knowing how a septic system works or needs to be maintained. There were some suggestions, such as a septic professional that described how we could give educational materials to a realtor that could explain a little bit more about how their system works, so that people don't just understand how it works when it fails, which is pretty common. And so with that addressing risk, we kind of can come together with all of what it means. And so for implications, we find that there are a lot of different things that impact behavior, and one of those is sense of place, because when you have a really strong sense of place, you're more likely to want to do something or be motivated to do something about it because you care about keeping your place the way it is. And then with environmental change, that impacts behavior, because noticing those environmental changes helps you find out what might be the root cause of that and how that can be addressed as well. And so kind of the key missing part is the knowledge of relevant information, because you're not likely to make a change until you know what the problem is and what it's all about. And so we're hoping that if we want to see individual behavior change or change on a bigger scale, that we can work towards the third part, because we know that that's kind of the only missing link and everything else is in place for more behavior changes to occur. So to talk a little bit more about raising awareness and how we did that through our podcast, here's Emily.
Thank you, Claire. So like Claire mentioned, understanding risk and improving access to information has been a common thread throughout the qualitative and quantitative portions of our research. And while we hope that our findings can be helpful to municipalities and local property owners, we also know that it's difficult for the information from this report and in this presentation to reach a wider audience. So our research begs a few questions, like how can we remove barriers to taking action on septic health? And how can our findings be more accessible to residents of coastal communities? So in an effort to address this, we created a podcast. And in its 3 episodes, we hope that it can be both a helpful tool for residents of places like the Outer Banks to more fully aware the implications of a changing climate on infrastructure like septic, as well as contribute to the greater conversation about how coastal communities are going to adapt to a changing climate in the future. So I can tell you a little bit about how we made it. The podcast is hosted by our very own Peter Marcoux, and it also includes interviews with some of us students as guest experts on different components of our research, as well as excerpts from interviews with the researchers and residents and public officials that we spoke to in our human dimensions component, many of whom are with us today. And it was compiled, the 3 episodes were compiled in their final versions in Adobe Premiere Pro. As you can see, this is our state-of-the-art recording studio that we constructed in our dorm to help reduce the echo from the microphone system. So for a brief overview of our 3 episodes, episode 1, which we called Fecal Matters, sort of sets the scene for what life is like in a barrier island community. It talks about sense of place here in Nags Head, and then also has a discussion of basic hydrology and the mechanisms of septic systems. In Fluent and Effluent, we dive deeper into our research and talk about what a changing climate and its impacts on septic means for water quality and residents' risk perception. And in our final episode, The Bottom Line, we talk about solutions like the town of Nags Head's Todd D. Craft Septic Health Initiative, and sort of zoom out for a greater discussion about how coastal communities are going to face these issues in the future. And now for an excerpt from our first podcast.
The water table is definitely higher, especially since Irene. That was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, I think. That one did really bad flooding here in Mania to where old timers around here said they saw water where they've never seen it before.
Hurricane Irene has lost some power, but is still threatening a catastrophic run up the East Coast.
One of the places expected to be hardest hit, the Outer Banks. Irene made a bad first impression, shrieking ashore North Carolina's Outer Banks, powerful and ominous.
Those are news clips about the hurricane Stephen Carignan was talking about. Hurricane Irene made landfall over the Outer Banks in August of 2011. Contractors like Stephen weren't the only ones affected by it. Every time storms like this hit, they have the potential to pretty radically change the Outer Banks, destroying homes, halting businesses for days or weeks, and altering ecosystems. For a long time, though, resilience against storms has been part of the identity of the people who live here. And even though storms and hurricanes are expected to get more intense in the future, preparing for them is seen by many residents here as a necessary hurdle to enjoy living on the coast.
That was Peter. So I know I really enjoyed putting together this process and sort of asking the creative questions of how our research can actually make an impact on communities like this and reach a bigger audience. And I encourage you all to check out the 3 episodes, which were released today. Album dropped. You can find links to them on the flash drives in this room, and then you can also Google OBXFS, like Andy said, to find it. And here's Anna Gray to talk about our final conclusions and provide some further recommendations.
Thank you, Emily.
The water table
Oh. There we go. So now that we put all of the pieces of our puzzle together, we're just going to go over some overall conclusions. So first, looking at our water level data through GIS analysis, we found that we found that about 50% of our study site was susceptible to groundwater, wastewater, surface water interactions. And then zooming in a bit closer on those spots and our water quality, we found that the groundwater lowering initiative that NAGSED took may have helped decrease those contaminants in the water, since we found that there were a lot lower concentrations of bacteria in the water. And then when we look at our human dimensions analysis, we found that different stakeholders have different risk perceptions based on the knowledge they have of the topic. So if we look at it all, taking a step back, we find that the susceptibility of an area leads to the presence of undertreated wastewater contamination, which leads to and determines risk of that area, and branching off into risk perception and how people are going to change their behavior once they have that risk perception. And since this is the second year of a 3-year study, we wanted to make some recommendations for next year's study. We hope to have the same sampling sites next year for better data comparison. On the picture on the left, you can see we tried to do some data mining. So we went to the Dare County Department of Public Health and pulled records on different developments that had septic maintenance or issues. So we think by having this information in the future, that would help us better conduct our research. And then we also wanted to look at water usage among people in the town and how they're using it and what they're using it for, to also help better gauge a full understanding of the topic. And with that, we go on to acknowledgments. Thank you so much to all of our professors, Andy, Lindsay, Linda, Corey. I know we all can't thank you enough for everything you've done for us. Our CAB members, thank you to you guys. You definitely guided us very well and helped us in determining different perceptions. Our internship mentors who helped us all so much learn about things that we were specifically interested in and really took on a bunch of undergrads, which was nice of them. Everyone who helped us this semester with our labs, experiences, field trips. And then lastly, we just wanted to take a moment and dedicate this project and our whole semester to Todd Kraft. He was a very active member of the community and passionate about public and septic health. And with that, does anyone have any questions for everyone? Yay. Yes. They have a mic for you, sorry.
We have people watching over the internet link, so you can please ask your question. Sure. To the microphone.
I'm curious as to the interviews with the public officials. Was there any indication in terms of like what inspection requirements there are on septic and whether they plan to change those and make those stricter in the future?
So with the interviews with the public officials, some of them did go over what the process is for inspections. But I think the septic health initiative that we have now, there's a connectivity between the inspectors, the public officials, and the property owners themselves that involve those inspections. And as of right now, it involves, if you want to get your septic system inspected, you just reach out to the town of Nags Head, the planning department, and they'll send an inspector your way. But was your question specifically about what the inspections entail?
Or are there any plans to increase the frequency of those inspections?
I don't know if I can answer that right now. I think it's more of a thing that once we are able to get more public awareness out there of the need for inspections, then we hope that that would increase, that the frequency of inspections would increase. But yeah.
You guys are awesome. That was great. I have a question about the PW, the pumping wells, right? Is that what PW stands for? Okay. So you have 2 years of data, and you've identified that there's a couple of different reasons why those 2 data points varied. And one of them might be because of the number of pumping wells. Did you get a sense of how many were installed between the 2 data collections, between 2018 and 2019? And did you get a sense also as to how cost efficient they are? And if that is something that the community, the homeowners might be on board for, if it's cost efficient, if it's going to improve the reduction of the bacteria in the septic systems?
Anyone want to take a crack at that?
So I believe that they installed 7 pumping wells between 2018's Capstone and our Capstone. With regards to the money question, it was not within the scope of our study to look at the cost effectiveness. I wish I could answer that for you, but we cannot today.
Congratulations. It was a great presentation and really, really interesting. I'm not an expert at all in this, but I'm curious about the data between 2018 and 2019 with a pretty significant decrease in the bacterial counts, which is awesome. If you're planning to do this for the 3rd year, because I think the dry and wet will have a significant effect, because from what you said, the more rain, the more flooding, the higher the chance of contamination. So it'll be really interesting to see if that theory holds out in a wet year after you've decreased the ground level table water, whatever it's called, to see if it's due to a dry year or how much effect the pumping wells have.
I definitely agree with that. I think we all agree with that. Yes, for sure.
Hi. Back to the PW, which seems to control most everything. What could you define a little more what happened? I mean, obviously, the water gets pumped. What happens to it? Where does it go?
Yeah, so once that water is pumped out of the groundwater, the water table, it is sent to a reservoir, whether that be one of the newly installed reservoirs that's meant to hold that. I'm not sure exactly where it is in Nag's Head, but it's around the area. Or it might just be pumped directly to the ocean. And yeah, does that answer your question, or do you want any more details?
A little more details. I was under the impression that you can't pump water like that into the ocean.
Yes.
I would just add that deciding where that water is sent depends on how close it is. So if it's very close to the ocean, that's where it will go. Does that help?
Thank you.
Okay.
I would also like to clarify, though, for this groundwater lowering that the town did, that water is all pumped into a different reservoir and not into the ocean.
Hi. I also want to say you guys have done a fantastic job, and I appreciate all of the work that you've done with your research. So to kind of piggyback off the last question, when you pump off the groundwater, how will that affect if you know the fertility or the viability of the surface ground? So with the water being gone, then is it going to be more difficult to grow our grasses and our plants?
So I think this is also a really good question that's outside of the scope of our study a little bit. But I'm willing to bet that it would not affect any ability you'd have to grow plants in the soil. Oh.
I think it could, totally speculating, but I feel like because the project was supposed to reduce flood waters, the ability to grow grass and plants might improve. Just something to keep in mind.
Thank you. I think your project was of interest to everybody in the Outer Banks, and we thank you for that. My question is on the wells, and I wasn't familiar with the wells. I know Nags Head has these that are in the area that you studied, if I'm correct. Do you know whether the Outer Banks has any plans to put more wells in other locations like Kitty Hawk or different ones? Was that brought up at all?
Our project was based on what Nags Head was doing, so we can't really speak on what other cities are doing.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to go ahead and commend all the students on the research work that you did. On behalf of the town of Nags Head, thank you. My name is David Ryan. I serve as the town engineer for the town of Nags Head, and I've worked directly in a lot of these groundwater lowering projects. So I think that's where a lot of these questions are centered. First, in the study area, there was actually two separate projects that were performed. One on the upstream reach of the Red Drum Ocean Outfall, which was a lowering of the pipe that traversed the beach road, and that was a conventional means of going ahead and lowering the groundwater on the downstream end of that system. On the upstream end, we did a project in one of our west side neighborhoods in the Nags Head Acres subdivision, where we installed 7 vertical wells to lower the groundwater in that area. And then that water is discharged back into Nags Head Woods into an existing reservoir that we are currently have a companion project in the Vista Colony subdivision where we are discharging water within that natural infiltration area. That system, or the Vista Colony system, has been in operation for 6 years. We've been monitoring that project for water quality as well as flows, and we've had some pretty good success with addressing the frequency of flooding in that area. And this was an opportunity for us to go ahead and build on that and expand into one of our adjoining neighborhoods. And so we've had some good success with the operation of that system, both for smaller storms as well as hurricanes that have really been beneficial to those west side neighborhoods. And we are looking at this as a creative way, an innovative way to addressing stormwater management, and also the secondary benefit of on-site wastewater management through groundwater lowering, not only for this type of method, but other methods that we have installed here recently, and other applications that we can apply throughout the town in the future. So, thank you.
I think we have an online question next.
21st century.
Do you want me to?
Why did you all decide? Yeah, but read the whole thing.
Okay. Elizabeth Kendrick says, "Hi everyone, great job. I participated in the Outer Banks field site last year. My question is, and forgive me if you said this, but why did you all decide not to redo caffeine measurements?"
I believe there were the background concentrations of caffeine in one of the native plants here. Do you guys remember what? Yopon holly. Thank you guys. Yeah. So we did not do that again because it wouldn't be conclusive of whether it was from humans or from just the natural environment.
Great. And then Emma would like to piggyback off of that and ask, how did you pick your variables in relation to previous work, i.e. no nutrient measurements?
So, Emma, my name is also Emma. We did do nutrient measurements, but based on what we found, it wasn't super conclusive or super
relevant to what we wanted to present to y'all today. So if you read the report, there are nutrients in there, but also kind of similar to the caffeine is that there are already nutrients present in the environment, so it's pretty hard to distinguish whether or not those nutrients are at bad levels from humans or if they're just the regular levels that are naturally occurring in the environment.
We have time for a few more audience questions if anybody else has any.